So we're going to begin. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Ramon Pacheco Pardo and I'm the KF-VUB Korea Chair at the Institute for European Studies of Free University of Brussels. I'm going to very briefly introduce today's events and the two co-organizers before we move to the open address by Ambassador Kim. So this event on the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic Alliances and the role in the Korean Peninsula, we started to discuss it a few months ago with our partners at Brookings and our partners at the ASEAN Institute, and we thought that it would be very timely as we move forward in different negotiation processes with North Korea, but obviously there are many other issues that have to be dealt with that seem not to be catching the attention of the media, for example, or even policymakers at this point in time. So we thought we would discuss them, hence the event that we're having today. This is part of a series of 3 events that we hope to have first in Brussels, then in Washington DC, and then in Seoul. So it's going to be a series in which we will bring European perspectives, Korean perspectives, American perspectives. Can you hear me well, or do I need the microphone? I need a microphone. I'm not going to repeat my... Okay, I'm not... I'm not going to repeat myself. So very briefly to finish with my introduction, a few thanks. I would like to thank both NATO and the Embassy of the Republic of Korea for their sponsorship of today's events. And I would like to thank our guests coming from Seoul and from Washington DC, from the ASEAN Institute and from Brookings Institution for making it all the way to Brussels for today's event. And without any further ado, I'll leave it to my colleague, Professor Yoon Park.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you, Ramon, for honchoing this event today. I'd like to thank all of you. I know these are busy times for all of you and for spending this afternoon with us. And thank you to Ambassador Kim, as well as to the Embassy of South Korea and the Korea Foundation and NATO. And I'd also like to thank Max Ernst and Paula Quintero from VUB, who have been so helpful in helping to organize this event. And I really welcome this partnership with ASEAN and with VUB to have this series of conversations. Next year we'll be at Brookings, so we'll hope to see you in Washington as well. So let me turn this over to Chaegang.
Okay. Thank you, John. My name is Chaegang, Vice President of ASEAN Institute. First of all, I'd like to convey Dr. Hamjebom, the President of ASEAN Institute, his warm gratitude to every one of you. He was about to come to Brussels, but actually because of the affairs he has to take care of in Seoul, he could not join us, but actually he'd like to be with you. And secondly, actually, this is the beginning of a trilateral cooperation among the pre-university in Brussels and Brookings and ASEAN. And also, actually, we'd like to talk about this Transatlantic and Transpacific Alliances in the coming years and all of the issues we are facing nowadays. I'm sure we will be benefiting exchange of ideas and perspective on this issue, and also we'd like to expand the area of cooperation among the democratic countries in the world. And also I'd like to thank personally the Ambassador Kim Hyung-jae. He was my roommate in the 4-party talks. Actually, I am very much delighted to see him, and also I'd like to thank for the Embassy's support for this project and also continuation of his support for this project. Thank you. Ambassador Kim.
Professor Ramon Pardo, Dr. Kang Choi, Dr. Jung Park, and Dr. Bom Chul-shin, Dr. Alexander Martoller, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to give a remark at a conference organized by VUB Institute for European Studies, Brookings Institution, and ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies. First, I would like to extend my congratulations to all of you for organizing the first of an annual event on the Transatlantic and Transpacific Alliances. It is high time to have regular consultations among Brussels, Washington DC, and Seoul. Today's meeting is more meaningful as this year marks the 55th anniversary of diplomatic relationship between the EU and Korea. And there is a lot of food for thought for deterrence and engagement in the Korean Peninsula. The EU and Korea have nurtured an invaluable strategic partnership since 1963. The two sides are expanding cooperation from the traditional political and economic areas to the new areas of climate change, human rights, international security, and development assistance. In fact, Korea is still the only country that has 3 key agreements in full effect with the EU in political, economic, and security areas. That is, Framework Agreement, FTA, and Crisis Management Participation Agreement. Further, based on the common values of democracy, market economy, rule of law, and human rights, the two sides are natural partners in international fora. President Moon visited Brussels last week to participate in the ASEAN Summit meeting and to have a meeting with President Tusk and President Juncker. The two sides agreed on legal frameworks for future cooperation and mechanisms for the future engine of growth. A joint statement on illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing was signed, and the aviation horizontal agreement was initialed, while cooperation on data protection has been strengthened. High-level dialogues on ICT, transportation, and small and medium businesses have been launched. President Moon proposed the East Asia Railroad Community in his speech on August 15, Korea's Liberation Day, citing the example of the ECSC developing into the EU. He mentioned the railroad community could develop into the East Asia Economic and Energy Community, and further into the East Asia Multilateral Peace and Security Mechanism. He had already shown his appreciation of the EU by sending a special envoy to the EU for the first time as an incoming Korean president right after his election in May last year. The strategic alliance between Korea and the United States is a linchpin for peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia. While the EU maintains strategic partnerships both with Korea and the United States, it is natural for the three sides to help and consult one another on North Korean issues. Many changes are happening on the Korean Peninsula. Compared with last year, a totally different picture is now being unfolded there. As Secretary Pompeo mentioned, the world stands at the dawn of a new day in relations with North Korea, as progresses are being made for the denuclearization of North Korea. President Trump and North Korean leader agreed on the complete denuclearization and lasting peace regime on the Korean Peninsula at their historic meeting last June in Singapore. 3 months later, President Moon visited Pyongyang to have his third meeting with Chairman Kim, who confirmed again his commitment to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, expressing his hope to focus on economic development. Even if appraisals are different, no one disputes that the current dialogue process for the denuclearization of North Korea needs to be encouraged, especially North Korea's destruction of nuclear weapon test site and its ongoing dismantlement of a long-range missile test site and launch site can be a good starting point to the complete denuclearization. At the moment, North Korea seems to put emphasis on the removal of sanctions and economic development. Last April, North Korea adopted a new strategic policy line to put all their resources and energy into economic development. North Korean leaders' recent public activities have predominantly been related to economic growth of North Korea. Both deterrence and engagement are needed for the North Korean issues. While being vigilant, we need to induce North Korea to continue to take positive steps for the complete denuclearization. That is why President Moon asked President Macron to consider relaxing sanctions to expedite the denuclearization process once it reaches an irreversible stage. With various high-level meetings on the table, such as North Korean leaders' return visit to South Korea, possibly within this year, the second summit meeting between the United States and North Korea, Chinese president visit to North Korea, North Korean leaders visit to Russia, and the Pope's visit to North Korea. Close coordination and consultation among related countries will be needed more than before. On each part, Korea will do its best to realize the complete denuclearization and establish permanent peace in the Korean Peninsula on the basis of sustainable inter-Korean relations. In this process, we look to the continued support from the like-minded partners. In this sense, today's discussion will be helpful to think the North Korean issues from a strategic point of view. I wish you will have fruitful and intensive discussions which will provide useful insights for policymakers too. Thank you very much for your attention.
We are a little bit behind the schedule, so I will skip the introduction of the speakers. So instead of making them to make a presentation, I'd like to pose questions. So it's a test of their expertise. So when they fail or pass, you will judge. So actually, first of all, the title of this is like sparing the deterrence and engagement in Northeast Asia and Europe. So for that reason, I'd like to start with a question about the similarity and difference between the two regions. So that actually gives a background for what kinds of strategy you have to use in dealing with the challenges ahead of us. First of all, I'd like to ask Dr. Professor Kim to start on that issue. Then I will ask another set of questions. So please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chair. I have a couple of students of mine in the audience, so I really don't want to fail. Maybe I will just focus on the first two questions or so Dr. J has given me. First of all, let me start with a question of comparison of East Asia and Europe from deterrence and engagement angle. So what are the similarities between East Asia and Europe? In both regions, the United States provides military protection to many states through formal alliance agreements. The extended deterrence has been quite successful in terms of preventing war against US allies. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as the cases where US defense obligation is really applicable, I'm not sure if there has ever been any war waged against a US ally after the Second World War. There have been cases where there have been some military challenges, but in terms of the timing and the applicability of US alliance obligations, I think the allies who are actually protected by legal obligations of the US alliance treaties have been protected really well. In both Asia and Europe, US allies face non-democratic and militarily powerful states, China in Asia and Russia in Europe, so that's also one similarity. And both China and Russia in recent years have been challenging US extended deterrence with a so-called gray zone tactic to avoid triggering US military intervention. So Russia's little green men are famous or notorious, and in Asia we also talk about China's little blue men, maritime militias, sort of trying to challenge the administration of the Senkaku or Jiaoyu Islands in the East China Sea. Both Asia and European allies are concerned about the erosion of US alliances' credibility because of President Trump's rhetoric about alliances. And they also share concerns about US pressure for burden sharing. Now, what are the differences between the two regions? First of all, everybody likes to talk about the hub and spoke system in Asia. So in Asia, the United States has a network of bilateral alliances, and in Europe, there is NATO, a multilateral military alliance. Theoretically speaking, it should be very different, and NATO allies have to defend each other, whereas allies of the United States in Asia, they don't really have defense obligations among the spokes. But in reality, I think it's really the United States that has been doing most of the work of the deterrence and defense. One big difference in the two regions, there's no North Korea in Europe, and we are really fortunate in that regard. North Korea is a serious military problem for East Asian allies, especially for South Korea. But North Korea probably has also provided somehow a politically convenient context for US alliances, both for deterrence and engagement purposes. North Korea creates some necessity for everyone to engage each other, and measures for deterrence, like missile defense, for example, these measures can be better justified against North Korea than against China. Disputes that present the largest threat to US alliances in the two regions also are quite different in nature. North Korea's nuclear threat is a wild card, so let me ignore it for the moment, and let's just focus on China and Russia. China's challenges against US allies are in the ocean, mostly. So China has maritime territorial disputes with Japan, the Philippines, and also non-allies security partners in Asia. Whereas Russia's threat is really felt on the land, closer to the home territories of the allies. So maritime disputes in Asia may be less directly threatening than disputes on the land in Europe, because maritime borders and maritime territories are far away from the home territory of the disputants. However, this may actually increase the likelihood of dispute initiation and dispute escalation if the disputants believe that it is easier to contain conflict in the ocean. So ironically, that might make Asian strategic situations more volatile. In terms of balance of power, in Asia, US allies have hard time balancing against China on their own, whereas in Europe, if Europeans really work hard, I think they can balance against Russia. So that's also a very big difference. And because of this difference, I personally think that it is more important for the United States to assure US allies in Asia about a US defense commitment than assuring European allies. Should I?
Okay, sure. Okay.
Thank you.
From that, I think this, I'd like to pose a different question to Bomcho, actually, because you are specialized in North Korean affairs. So, actually, how North Korean challenges affect the deterrence posture of ROK and US has maintained over the past 6 decades? What kinds of challenges we are faced with North Korean problems, and then also, of course, what would be a mix of engagement and deterrence?
Very difficult question.
And also one more thing, because actually you are, of course, we are from same institute. I'd like to ask, is there firm belief or trust in U.S. extended deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea? So allies' perspective on the alliance. So you can.
Okay, thank you, my boss, Dr. Choi. I'm Bom Chol. I'm a senior fellow at the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies. It's great to see you all. I have experience of having similar conference 3 years ago, the same hotel, same floor, which have a nice view. It's great to be here again. And thank you very much for your participation. Let me just touch by Dr. Kim's comment regarding the similarity in Europe and Korean Peninsula. I think there's a very similar thing between Europe and Korea. First one is we are ally of the United States. Europe has a NATO alliance, it's a multilateral alliance system, but South Korea has a bilateral alliance system with the United States, and we face a nuclear threat from different anniversary, probably Europe. As we know, the current debate on the INF Treaty, so Europe is threatened by the potential nuclear threat from Russia. South Korea is the same from that of North Korea's nuclear threat. And third one is, but we have maintained our deterrence from potential adversary. First, based upon our own conventional military forces, plus extended deterrence from United States. That is the link to the Dr. Che's question about how we can trust the United States extended deterrence. I believe there's enough credibility of U.S. extended deterrence, because without providing that deterrence and without actually functioning that kind of deterrence, United States itself cannot maintain its leadership over the globe. I think that's the most important thing when it comes to about the credibility of U.S. deterrence. On the other hand, we also have some sort of mechanism. Here in Europe, there is nuclear planning groups to specify the kind of deterrence. On the other hand, South Korea, we newly established a new mechanism talking about the extended deterrence. So we actually work on the details of how to realize the extended deterrence. On the other hand, the first one is an important one is here in Europe and Korean Peninsula, we try to solve this problem with engagement, dialogue with Russia, here and there in Korea, dialogue with North Korea. That's our approach. The second question Dr. Choi raised was how we can maintain our deterrence in the Korean Peninsula specifically. As we know, North Korea probably have enough nuclear fission material to make dozens of nuclear weapons. We all know that. They probably made some nuclear weapons and stockpile them, but we don't know. And then they also have a huge conventional forces, 1.2 million military personnel. That is a tremendous threat to us. To deter North Korea's military threat, South Korea built our conventional forces. We made a lot of effort. So we have emphasized the build-up of our ISR capabilities and the striking capabilities. So we revised the missile guideline with the United States. So we increased our missile capability. When North Korea make a nuclear test and missile test, we consultate the kind of our capability with the United States to increase our conventional military capability. That is one thing. On the other hand, as I told you before, we also consultate with the United States in detail regarding the extended deterrence. So I don't know, there's still difference. So in Europe, there is nuclear sharing here. So with the NATO's Air Force platform, they might carry the U.S. Tactical nuclear weapon. So you have the kind of cooperation, but South Korea does not have that upgraded cooperation. So the next step might be kind of cooperation in that area. However, these days in the Korean Peninsula, there is an engagement effort from South Korean government. The Moon Jae-in administration, since start of last year May, it made a great effort to engage with North Korea. So the effort finally gets some result. So this year we have a 3 times summit between South Korea and North Korea, and we made 2 agreements, which one is Pyongyang in April, next one is September 19th, first one is Panmunjom, and second one is Pyongyang. So that is a kind of a confidence building measure between South Korea and North Korea. With that kind of effort is ongoing, so this time the South Korean government is not emphasizing extended deterrence for a while. However, if the negotiation goes well, there's no necessity to increase the kind of build up our military measures. However, if the negotiation would fail, then there will be another cooperation between the alliance to strengthening the kind of extended deterrence. Is it okay for you, sir?
Okay, I will come back to you later. So, one quick question could be about whether South Korea is going to nuclear or not. So that was
Next
the
time.
issue. Next time. Actually, Tom, because you're from DC, so I'd like to ask a question about how U.S. views the transatlantic relations and trans-Pacific relations. From the actually, as a person from Korea, actually, U.S. is so much preoccupied with transatlantic relations, despite all the rhetorics coming from DC. Since the 21st century is Asia-Pacific century, U.S. is fully committed toward the Asia-Pacific region. So, as a person who are following the European affairs and also the President Trump, how do you see, is there any kinds of parallel balance between transatlantic relations and trans-Pacific relations from U.S. perspective?
Yeah, thank you. And firstly, it's a great pleasure to be here and really exciting to be talking about the DPRK in Asia in Brussels, of all places. So I think that's wonderful, because I do come here and usually talk about Brexit or Eurozone. So I'm very excited to sort of unite those 2 things I'm really interested in Europe and Asia. It's a great question, and I think there's often sort of a false choice that's set up. I mean, for the US, I think historically, as well as currently, setting aside the current president, just thinking about the country as a whole, choosing between the Pacific and the Atlantic is a little bit like, expressing favoritism between your first and second children. I mean, I think they're both equally special, right? And what everyone agrees on is that they're both more important than the Middle East. And I think that's actually it's sort of humorous, but I think that's actually true when you talk to people on strategy in Washington. Everyone sort of agrees that those 2 sort of key theaters of East Asia and Europe are as important as they've ever been. And if one is not particularly important at a given point in time, it's because it seems like it's in pretty good shape, right? So 10 years ago, there was lots of people saying the United States needs to pivot. They said from the Middle East to East Asia, but they also sort of meant from the Atlantic to Asia, and that the US was underinvested in Asia. But a underlying assumption of that statement was that the US position in Europe was really good, and that Europe had very few strategic problems. So it wasn't saying that both were sort of in trouble and Asia was more important, right? It was saying that Europe had been sort of quote unquote fixed, whatever that means. But that now is no longer operative, because Europe, of course, in the last 10 years has had a striking reversal of fortune on multiple fronts. And so now the challenges, I think, in Europe and in East Asia are fundamentally different, but they are equally serious. And I don't really have any doubt that as long as the US remains an international superpower, and that's a big sort of open question, I think the US will be engaged in both regions. I did want to say, I'm happy to also, if you want to get into how Trump sees it and everything, but that's sort of a rabbit hole. If we go down, it's hard to know if we'll get back up. I would just say one thing about the lessons from Europe for East Asia, because I think the parallel is not with the present security situation, but with the Cold War, which of course is when extended deterrence was really invented. And the lesson is that extended deterrence is really, really, really difficult, like really difficult. And it's unnatural, and it doesn't make a lot of sense on a rational basis, and it's continually questioned, and it requires continuous work, which is often acrimonious to ensure that it's credible, right? So throughout the Cold War, you see the United States clashing with allies on the meaning of making extended deterrence credible. And there are all sorts of doubts about whether, you know, West Berlin is sort of worth Boston or New York in terms of that overall strategic situation. And it was sustained because the United States was heavily motivated in a global Cold War against communism, and that had the whole country up in arms, and that provided the glue that allowed for extended deterrence to occur. And for all of the talk about Russia maybe or maybe not threatening to an invasion of the Baltics, that's a pretty remote possibility now. You know, that's it. We're much more into the gray zone, sort of active measure space, which is not extended deterrence. And so I would just say for the DPRK case that I am sort of worried a little bit about the application of extended deterrence, because sometimes we have an assumption that this is just really easy, right? This is done in Europe, so you just take it, you just apply it to North Korea. It doesn't matter if they have long-range, you know, ICBMs, because this will work. But it almost didn't work here. It was a different situation and required a huge amount of effort, and certain things that were heavily contested and controversial. And there was debates here on détente versus containment and Reagan and all of that, but you can see some parallels, I think, on the US position on North Korea and the differences with Seoul.
Thank you. So the second question I have is like, of course, so especially Bomchul's, Tom mentioned of the gray zone nowadays is much more difficult to apply the extended deterrence automatically or mechanically, because we are faced with a little bit different types of threats. So, but you don't have any doubts about the U.S. extended deterrence. How do you see the President Trump's America First policy? And of course, we are in a process, I mean, the ROK U.S. In a process of adjusting its combined defense posture. Actually, the three issues usually pop up. One is a wartime operational control, command structure. Third is a burden sharing issue. How do you see the robust?
What is the second?
Second is a new command structure.
First one is?
The wartime operational control.
Is it the same?
No, this is a little bit technical. One is a OPCON, the other one is a system. So
okay.
you can combine these two together. How do you see each side should handle this? Because actually, for example, the President Trump mentioned about when he finished his meeting with Kim Jong-un in July, in June, say, this military exercise provocative and expensive. So we have suspended the joint military exercise for the time being. So do you see any shortcoming of the suspension as continuing of that suspension into the future?
Let me go to first question, whether I like the Trump's America First or not. I don't like. Probably nobody in Europe country like U.S. America First policy, because for the time being, as a Korean, when you look at the longest alliance for the last almost 70 years, the United States is a really benevolent alliance partners, almost all over the last 70 years, exactly 65 years. But the inauguration of the Trump administration changes a lot. The first, when I'm a strong supporter of a U.S. alliance there in Korea, the reason why is the United States, the first thing is that they put the value with a great importance They're leader of the free world, and then freedom and human rights. The purpose of maintaining that kind of alliance was based on that kind of value. So we support the various alliance. However, in the name of America First policy, the Trump administration is different from the former US government. That's problematic, not good, not only for South Korea, but probably also here in Europe. But anyway, that's the reality of the United States. The United States has changed because it has its own problem, domestic problem. So probably the next president, whoever will be, might be different from the former president of the United States. So we must accept, we must see the changes in the United States and adapt our policy with the United States to maintain strong and sustainable alliance. That's one thing. Second one is in details in Korea. We are talking about the OPCON transition. Maybe next week there will be the SCM security consultative meeting between the two ministers from United States and South Korea. Last year, the SCM promised that we are going to announce about the discussion of the OPCON transition this year. So there will be a new announcement. I changed my mind. I was strong supporters of OPCON transition maybe 5 years ago. However, not this day, because for the last several years, North Korea increases its nuclear capability drastically. So South Korea alone cannot compete with North Korea. So we need strong U.S. engagement here in the there in the Korean Peninsula. I used to say here in the Korean Peninsula, but this is Europe. So there is there in the Korean Peninsula. So we must involve United States commitment strong manner there in the Korean Peninsula. But the OPCON transition itself based upon the 2 or 3 things. One is the changes security environment. If North Korea's threat is decreased, there is a huge opportunity for better OPCON transition. That's one thing. However, although we have a negotiation with North Korea, but their denuclearization activity is slow. That's one concern. Second one is South Korea's military build-up. We promised to build up our military to compete with the North Korea's military threat. But the problem today is because of the ongoing negotiation with the North Korea, there will be some limitation of our military build-up because the Pyongyang announced agreement involved in the attachment of a military agreement that agreed to the military North-South Joint Military Committee. It might deal with the military build-up of each side. So if South Korea wanted to build up our conventional forces, maybe North Korea might raise opposition to that. So if North Korea's nuclear threat is there, it's very hard for South Korea maintaining deterrence in the both ways, in the threat perception or our military build-up. So I think for the time being, we need a stable alliance system. So I oppose the early OPCON transition. That's the reason why I changed my position. Anyway, the second question is that how to make the new commander system. It's simple. To change his position. Changing position is the most effective one. Today, the commander of the CFC is the United States, Foster General of the United States, and the vice commander is the Foster General of South Korea. If we change the position, Foster Korean General as commander and the Foster US General as a vice commander, then there will be no problem. However, whether that will be sustainable, I don't think so. That's another concern of me about the OPCON transition. From the beginning, year 2007, when we first agreed the OPCON transition, we separated the unified commander as two systems. Instead, we made the agreement to build up the consultative mechanism. However, it might not deal with the North Korean threat effective way. That's the reason why we agreed to maintain unified commander after the OPCON transition. However, if we make it really sustainable, I think that there is a certain condition must be provided. That's what I call the South Korea Poster General and U.S. Poster General in the same commander. But I don't know whether United States, in particular, Trump administration would accept that kind of idea. Third one, this is the most difficult one, burden sharing. The America First policy entails burden sharing of every alliance partner of the United States. Maybe here in Europe, maybe first visit of President Trump was to Europe, and he emphasized the burden sharing last year, right? Same to South Korea. We have a 5-year deal of a burden sharing agreement. This is the year, make a new agreement for next 5 years. But as far as I know, the negotiation is not went well. It doesn't seem to went well. It seems going well because there's two different voices. The United States reportedly, this is reportedly, I'm not in the government anymore, so I don't know exact position of the US and the Korean government, but some news media reported that the United States wants 50% of increase of burden sharing, SMA. We approximately provide $1 billion every year, but the United States increased 50%, $1.5 billion every year. But that's not probably acceptable for South Korean government. On the other hand, regarding the detailed list, United States wanted to include the compensation, the expense, and the expense of the military exercise expense in the kind of a burden sharing special measure agreement. However, the special measure agreement, the burden sharing, the South Korea's donation of money, that is actually focused on the U.S. residency in South Korea. It entails with that money. However, if the United States added a new list of burden sharing, that changes the kind of a mechanism of burden sharing, frankly speaking. So I cannot support the U.S. Attempt to include the new list. However, as I told you, I'm a strong supporter of the organised alliance. This is very critical time for South Korea because we have to solve North Korea's nuclear problem, and we should maintain a strong organised alliance during the negotiation. So I suggest maybe we can increase not 50%, but maybe 20 or 30% of burden sharing, but we do not add a new list. Maybe there will be a peace in 2 years later with a peace agreement. Then there will be a potential new agreement between the two partners. Because basically the burden sharing is made to maintain strong deterrence against the United States. So this time we accept the US proposal in part. However, maybe someday after, if the negotiation goes well, then there is opportunity to decrease the amount of money. I'm sorry, I'm too long. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tong-Hee, I'd like to ask a question about the same, about how Europeans view America First policy, and how they are going to respond to the possibility of increase of defense spending by 2%, more specifically.
Thank you. Well, I've been living in Europe, but I can't really say I'm a European, so I can't represent the European view as such, but from my personal interactions with my European colleagues, I think you all know what the European public opinion, and especially people in academia or the policy circles are like towards the Trump administration. So they are very much critical to the current US administration's policy. On the other hand, I don't know how many people are from NATO, but for example, some people who were advocating the increased defense spending in Europe, they were not that troubled by the basic message of the Trump administration. So for Europeans who actually welcome increased defense spending, I think the style of the Trump administration's message is problematic, but maybe they don't necessarily disagree so much about the basic direction it is supposed to be taking Europe to. I think America First policy can't be really appreciated in isolation in the security field, and I think people are troubled by developments in other fields. So how the administration might approach international treaties, trade arrangements, and non-security issues matter in alliance politics as well. Generally speaking, unilateral tendency of the Trump administration is not appreciated, and some Europeans even express a preference for more independent defense capabilities. But I guess, sorry for confusing you, but the general direction of the European defense circle, as I understand, is that they accept certain premises of the demand from the United States, and they understand the necessity to increase the defense efforts. But they don't appreciate the style or the package of the message from the Trump administration, and they definitely don't like other issue areas in which the Trump administration had pursued America First policy.
Okay. Tom, actually, let me pose quite similar question about how far and how long the American First policy will go. So whether there's kinds of the expansion of area of America First policy. Of course, we are seeing the expansion starting from trade and security, some other areas. So how far it can go, and the second, whether it is really backed up by public support, whether there is a kind of resistance coming from the public or from the establishment or deep state.
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's the billion-dollar question, I guess. Is this a permanent shift or is it a temporary aberration? And no one really knows the answer to that. I mean, you know, on the side of it's a permanent shift, and my colleague Bob Kagan has written a book about this quite recently, called The Jungle Grows Back, sort of arguing that there's a continuity from Obama to Trump, that both wanted to do less in the world, that both wanted to shift the burden to allies, and that is likely to continue because US internationalism was driven by anti-communism, and after the Cold War it was largely running on fumes, and now it's sort of running out. On the other hand, a lot of this is tangled up with Trump, you know, and his sort of unique view of the world. And to answer your second question, all of the available data we have from opinion polls shows that actually there is not support really for the policies of America First. If you look at the Chicago Council data, which is probably the best public opinion survey out there, the support for free trade, for alliances, for the US-ROK alliance, for NATO, are all at record post-Cold War highs this year. So people have reacted to Trump's America First policy by reaffirming their support for this traditional foreign policy. Now, the test is really in the voting, right? If they continue to vote for Trump or for whoever follows him in that vein, then that won't really matter that much. But there is a debate. I don't think that there are a lot of people on the foreign policy side who really buy into the Trumpian vision. I mean, this is the first administration in history maybe where a lot of the senior people went in to stop the president from achieving his vision rather than to help him. You know, so they joined to try to subvert it in some way. But I would say, in terms of what it is, I mean, he is, you know, he's got these views about the world that are very deeply rooted. And I think there were 3 of them. I've argued there were 3 of them that date back to 1987. He's very hostile to alliances. He starts talking about the world in 1987. He complains about South Korea and Japan and some of the Middle Eastern allies. So that's very deeply rooted just because he thinks it's a bad deal, and has always thought that. He's always opposed free trade, and he always supports authoritarian regimes in other countries, right? And those things he doesn't really veer away from. And I think when you apply that to today, he really cares about direct threats to America, right? He doesn't really care about anything else. So North Korea is interesting because the ICBM threat is a direct threat, and with Trump there's all of this. I mean, Young has done great work on Kim Jong-un, the psychology. I mean, there's a lot of psychology with Trump too, right? There were key figures in his life. The 1950s is one of them, living under the nuclear umbrella, you know, the nuclear Armageddon. He constantly talks about this uncle he had at MIT who did nuclear technology, and he believes that through osmosis, he basically got this wisdom that the fate of the world is on the brink. You know, he volunteered in the Reagan administration to run the arms control team, and the Reagan White House had to tell him no, that would not be a good idea. So he comes at this with the preconceived sort of notion that there is this nuclear threat, and this is coming from North Korea. This is a historic thing. And he doesn't care about geopolitics these days. You know, he doesn't care about geopolitics in Europe. He cares about nukes and the missiles that can hit America and trade, and that's it. And everything else is sort of an add-on, right, that can be used for an instrumental purpose or not. And that's a very different place than where the rest of the national security establishment is, where we all worry about the alliance and the broader configuration of the region and what it means for China and all of those things that we talk about at length. But for Trump, it's quite sort of simple. And I think he sees, now he sees a way to try to address that by this, I mean, I would call it accommodation of Kim Jong-un, but it was, but through the diplomacy, quote unquote, with the North Korean leader. But I don't think that this is really sustainable. I think it is I mean, we can try to put a coherence on it, and I think it is somewhat coherent in his mind, but it is really in his mind. I mean, it's not a sort of a grand strategy, that's widely shared in the country, that's been applied to a region in a sort of thoughtful and disciplined way. I mean, this is really sort of the musings of psychology of one person.
Actually, I'd like to ask a follow-up question about how Trump will deal with North Korea. How long he can maintain this kind of mode of dialogue with North Korea? What kinds of action North Korea will change Trump's mind or his approach toward North Korea? If there's no nuclear test, no missile test, that's good enough for Trump to maintain the current policy.
Yeah, I mean, someone once said to me that, to understand Trump, you really have to watch The Apprentice, where there were lots of twists but no plot. And I think that's sort of, I don't know where he intends this to end up. I'm sure there'll be lots of twists on a weekly basis or monthly basis. The next summit, some crisis or whatever. But I think ultimately, I mean, he's been pretty clear about this. I think as long as he can pretend that it's working, he will stick to it, right? And what does that mean? I think in a real sense, that means no missile tests and maybe no nuclear tests, but nothing that's on CNN that looks like a big explosion, right? That creates a visual that discredits what he's doing. And otherwise, enrichment and building up the military and doing all of these things, or pushing around the gray zone, I don't think he cares really about that. So as long as Kim Jong-un doesn't do anything, as when Trump is there, to obviously discredit by launching a missile test or refining the ICBM capability, I think Trump will basically pretend that this is working, and the people in the administration, like Bolton, who are probably furious that this is completely fictitious, will be sidelined and they'll be fired if they really object, and Pompeo will go along to get along because that's basically what he does. And you know, and it will probably last through to 2021, but it won't last forever. I mean, this thing is not, it's not based on reality, you know, and that's the, I mean, they have these formulation of words that aren't borne out by what has been agreed or what's actually been acted on, and they can string it out. It could easily be sustainable for the duration of his term, I think, in terms of how they present.
Of course, it depends on how North Korea would react. So for that, I'd like to ask, if you were a North Korean leader, what kinds of actions or negotiation strategy would you like to employ against Trump, Mr. Trump, President Trump?
That's a very good point. I think my professional career is 23 years. Among those 23 years, my major job is analysis of North Korea's intention. So I think I'm very good at that. I'm Kim Jong-un. I want to hold a nuclear weapon, but I want to improve the international relation. So I say I have an intention of complete denuclearization, but intention entails at the bottom line as a dismantle of the Iraq-US alliance. So I always say denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, because the existence of USFK always means existence of a US nuclear umbrella there. So I say that I have an intention of a complete denuclearization, but my condition is very, very critical. Look, I want self-denuclearization. Self-denuclearization means I, North Korea, decide which facility I'm going to dismantle. Then I'm going to dismantle without international inspection. I mean the detailed inspection. So I decide what kind of compensation United States or South Korea provide. That's the term of my denuclearization. So I call it self-denuclearization. Based upon this strategy, North Korea might success in dealing with the South Korean government. I'm South Korean. Our government is very good. I think North Korea is wolf, but South Korea is deer or sheep, because we are pure. We are really good. But in negotiation, we are so much stupid. Because we trust North Korea from the beginning without verification. That's my approach. I'm somewhat criticized on our government position, but I believe that our government's intention is really good. But our government approach is, since we lack of trust between South Korea and North Korea, we should build trust first. So we should provide North Korea what North Korea wants. That's the kind of approach that I oppose. And so we must care about the North Korea's bad intention. I believe that if North Korea really has a good intention, South Korea's approach will work. However, if not, we should be careful about the North Korea's bad intention. That's the reason I emphasize trust but verify. Thank you.
But actually, so how far North Korea, how long North Korea can maintain the moratorium without having any concrete compensation for what they have done? Because what they have done, I don't think those are really meaningful. But anyhow, they're underscoring, I have demolished Punggye-ri, Dongchang-ri. That's good enough, but I haven't received any corresponding compensation for that. How far North Korea can go along with that frame and without having any real good thing? For example, relaxation of the sanction. Do they want the declaration to end the war seriously?
I think that at this point, I think North Korea succeeded what they want. Because when you look at the last year's December, although there is a heightened of military tension, but there is a strong international sanction on North Korea. With the maintaining that strong sanction, North Korea's economy this fall might be disastrous. However, because of the kind of negotiation procedure, North Korea had already 3 times summit with China. I think Kim Jong-un will visit Russia soon, And then during that process, the strengthening the international sanction might be somewhat weakened. So let me give you an example. We cut off 90% of refined oil into North Korea, but there's the same gasoline price inside North Korea. We cannot explain that because there will be a certain support from Russia or China. Without that, we cannot explain that situation. So I think that at this moment, North Korea might get out of such kind of a very disastrous situation. So they fulfill the first step. Maybe sustainability, regarding the sustainability, maybe 2 years, 3 years. But North Korea's target is, I believe, not seeking such a kind of economic prosperity that enjoys South Korea or European country. They might get out of the difficult situation. Will be enough for Kim Jong-un. So maybe 2 years later, 3 years later, if the deal with the United States might be broken, at that time, if there's no strong international sanction like last December, then North Korea is the one who got success. That's my concern. So I think we have to maintain strong sanction. That's the different position of myself and our current government, Korean government. So I'm very sorry to say this in the open forum. But anyway, that's my assumption. And regarding the compensation, I think North Korea really want the lift of sanction. Whatever the lift of sanction or exemption of sanction, that it works for the other partners, China and Russia. It has many ramifications. So North Korea tried to wedge this kind of point between the United States and South Korea. That's their tactics. And regarding the declaration to end the Korean War, if we agree to the declaration to end the Korean War, the next step of North Korea is to dismantle UNC, United Nations Command. South Korean government used to say that if that is a political agreement and that it has no affection of UNC and the USFK. But what North Korea argued 2 weeks ago at the UN is to dismantle UNC, and that is combined with the voice of China and Russia. So next step is clear. So I believe that our government is too good, too nice. But I hope that our government to be at least the fox to fight against the wolf. That's my position.
Okay. So Hong-Yi Pomchol mentioned about the sanctions. He liked to continuation the sanction vis-a-vis North Korea. Of course, when President Moon Jae-in came to Europe last week and then he asked some kind of relaxation of sanctions, because we know what the European countries' response on that. But if I stretch the question a little bit further, under what condition European countries can think of the relaxation of sanctions or kinds of engagement vis-a-vis North Korea? Europeans used to be very much eager to engage North Korea in a more humanitarian way, like supplying of some humanitarian assistance to North Korea, like Germany provided beef, or some country provided medical supply. Also, under what condition European countries can relax the sanctions, and then what kinds of engagement policy Europeans can think of into the future?
This is actually a question I would really like to ask European leaders, but my guess is that only with American blessing. And frankly speaking, I'm skeptical that the Europeans care enough to lift sanctions, upset the United States. I mean, yes, they may have moral feeling and they may want to help the suffering people of North Korea, but I'm not sure if Europeans care enough about this issue. I mean, South Korea is a very different. They care about the people in North Korea, and they also have a really big stake in establishing a peaceful regime in the Korean Peninsula. So my guess is that unless the United States really approves it, European countries would be reluctant to use their political capital to lift economic sanctions on North Korea. I hope I'm wrong on this, but that's my guess.
What about this kind of generic idea of engagement? What types of engagement Europe can think of in changing the atmosphere or to contribute to the stabilization of the Korean Peninsula?
In terms of Europe's
The
role,
possibility of Pope's visit to Pyongyang will make a huge difference or not?
I doubt it, and my hope is that Europe can play a meaningful role once the tension between the United States and North Korea has sufficiently subsided, and when both sides are really ready to prepare a deal, then I hope Europe can really play a role there by creating some sort of a multilateral diplomatic arrangement and also maybe providing economic assistance. And making it multilateral really matters, I think. I mean, ideally, China and Russia and all these countries should be pitching in as well. But when we think about it, about the other previous nuclear aspirants, Gaddafi, he made a deal with the United States and the United Kingdom, and British Prime Minister Tony Blair. They are also sort of helped convince him that Gaddafi would be safe, and United Nations was also involved. And it looked like the multilateral arrangement would be giving some sort of credibility to the security guarantee, and it wasn't really explicit. And Gaddafi ended up being killed. And Iranians, they sort of believed in the multilateral process as well, and they were partially wrong and they were partially correct. I mean, because JCPOA wasn't a bilateral deal between the United States and Iran, it's still alive. I mean, not quite, but it's still alive. So making an international agreement multilateral and having some major states included, I think it makes a difference. Europeans can't stop the United States from attacking North Korea, but if there is some sort of environment in which the United States is willing to make a compromise with North Korea, I think the presence of Europe in diplomacy and economic engagement would make a major difference.
Okay, actually I forgot to open the floor. Actually, we started about 10 minutes late, and actually so let me ask organizer to extend the session about 10 minutes. So I'd like to open the floor, you can raise your question. But before that, actually, identify yourself and then make a very brief question. Is there any question? Please.
We're getting a microphone.
Great, thank you very much. I was hoping we'd get open up the dialogue a little bit. David Fouquet from the CERIS Graduate Studies Program at the Free University of Brussels. Thank you very much. I've gained a lot of insight and I appreciate the presentations, but I do get the feeling that this is a one-track presentation, that it seems to be focusing and stressing and underlining the threat, the challenge, the difficulties, and so on, perhaps as opposed to what the ambassador and what your president seems to be stressing: dialogue, possible conciliation, confidence building measures. If he's talking about a Northeast Asia railway community, energy community, economic community, these are different types of initiatives that are more aimed at reducing the threat as opposed to challenging it. Now, is this the intent of your message? Do you represent a different current from within your country?
Okay, that's one question. Okay, any other question? Opcho?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I believe that the current South Korean government want to, as you mentioned, that extend the dialogue with North Korea and expand the cooperation with North Korea and expand the economic relation with North Korea, so to build the trust between the two Korea, and North Korea threat might be decreased as a result of it. Result of that kind of expansion of cooperation. But we already have that experience in early 2000. The result was, yes, as President Kim Dae-jung and President Roh Moo-hyun tried attempt that approach, but North Korea at the time, I believe, cheated the South Korea government. This time, South Korea government really has good intention. However, if North Korea once again successfully cheat the South Korea government, the result is nuclear North Korea. So I emphasize that we should be careful, we should be prudent. But anyway, I agree the current government attempt. I think that we should engage with North Korea. The former government, the conservative government, lacks that attempt. That's problematic. So I think that on the one hand, our government approach is necessary, but should be prudent. The reason I attached one thing, that I think that the lift of sanction, we must attach the North Korea's detailed denuclearization activity. From the beginning, I argued that we should go simple. Freeze, report, verify, dismantle of North Korea's nuclear program. Then we should provide exemption of flying sanction and lift of sanctions step by step from 2397 and then 2375 and 2371. Then important sanctions are disappeared. That should be the way we should contact North Korea from the beginning. However, we failed to that. This time, we accept North Korea's step-by-step synchronized approach, which North Korea divide Punggye-ri missile test site, Dongchangri, Punggye-ri nuclear test site, Dongchangri missile test site, and Yongbyon and the forbidden facilities like that. But the Punggye-ri and Dongchangri is almost useless. So we should start the lift of sanction or exemption of sanction from the Yongbyon facility. But we must agree, made agreement with North Korea about the full verification of the site. What I call the self-denuclearization means North Korea dismantle first and then verify based upon the North Korea's report. But we cannot verify after North Korea dismantle of the site. So I think previous verification before dismantle is necessary. That is the first step of whether we apply exemption or lift of sanction. Thank you.
Okay, is there a question? Okay, maybe.
Good afternoon, Chiara Zanini from Track to Asia. My question is related to the European engagement. So far, there's been little engagement from the EU, and I wanted to ask, what do you think could be a way of engaging more with the EU? There was just a summit between the EU and South Korea, but there were no statements at the end, and I don't know, what could be a good way of engaging the EU?
I'd like to collect more questions.
Jonathan Friedman, Belgian Customs. I had a small question. Within the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula debate, how much do the stakeholders look at the external capabilities? For example, the buildup of nuclear weapons by North Korea, but in different countries.
Cho, so you can say about the engagement and EU engagement and external capabilities. So
EU engagement?
yes. Also
Tom, yeah.
Okay, sure.
About a good way for European engagement of North Korea. This is just my personal opinion, but I really hope that European governments can somehow convince the United States about the benefit of sending humanitarian aid to North Korea, with really good screening of things that could please and support the top leaders of the regime. And there are, I think, it's not, I support this mostly for the people of North Korea, but I think there could be some benefits for countries like China and South Korea as well, for example. Some scholars have, for example, argued that European NGOs who have worked in North Korea could be playing a very useful role if the North Korean regime destabilizes and if there's a chance of massive migration, possibly within and from North Korea. The argument is that by having a good point of contact where aid material can be quickly delivered and having a familiar face that is actually trusted by the local people, you could discourage the local people from fleeing the location. And then, I don't know, fleeing into China or trying to cross into South Korea. And I think it's really important if the North Korean regime destabilizes. It is actually really important to sort of freeze the situation for the moment, and then so that we can buy time to really deal with it well. And so humanitarian aid organizations, these organizations could be the points of contact for something like that. So I think South Korean government, the Chinese government, they should have a strong interest in supporting that kind of approach. We have to invest in something that connects the North Korean people with the outside world. And in that regard, I hope European governments would become very supportive of humanitarian organizations that have done really excellent work in the past in North Korea.
Okay.
Regarding the first question, I think I really hope the European countries support the South Korean government's approach to North Korea, effort of engagement. I think it's necessary to get a momentum of proceed dialogue. But my point was only I'm 90% supporters of the Korean government. Only 10% was regarding the lift of economic sanctions. We should be careful in maintaining strong US coordination during the negotiation with North Korea. That's my point. What was the second point? I'm sorry, I have bad ears, getting old.
My question was, within the denuclearization debate, how much do the stakeholders, such as the US and the South Korean government, also look at the possibilities of North Korea to develop nuclear arms, but outside of the nuclear peninsula?
I think that the stakeholders mainly is 2+2+2+1, I believe. The first two is inter-Korea, North and South, as direct parties, and the United States and China. Second two, they are involved. The North Korea's nuclear issue will be solved with this 2+2 mechanism, I believe, because there will be eventually peace treaty among four parties. The next two is Japan and Russia. There's some kind of influence of the Korean Peninsula. They're part of the six-party talks, so they involve the issue. And then last one is a European country. So when we talk about the agreed framework and we provide the nuclear reactor, light water nuclear reactor to North Korea, European countries got involved in the procedures and you donate a lot of money to them. And with your support, the negotiation goes smoothly. So I think the last one is the United States. But the mainly 2+2 and then last 2+1 is kind of supporters and then I'm providing better ambience. And regarding the potential leakage of North Korea's nuclear proliferation issues, I don't think North Korea proliferates nuclear with others because that is the red line of the United States. If that happens, United States might really strike North Korea. Unless do that, the United States will not likely strike North Korea.
but there's a couple of incidents we observe. Like one is the Syrian case, the other one is like Myanmar. There's a collaboration between North Korea and those two countries. So, but nowadays I haven't heard any argument concerned about the proliferation issue. It's about only North Korea, but they have never actually. I was wondering why U.S. is now not raising the possibility of proliferation issue. Is that right? My observation. I'm in the piece about the time, and also this about this the engagement part of U.S. policy toward North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, I think proliferation is a red line, but then there are great parts around that line, right? And that may be what we see in Syria and elsewhere, but I think it is very much a long-term concern. Just on this discussion on engagement, you know, I think we're not just here, but generally having a discussion that we're saying it's about one thing and it's actually about something else. So we're telling ourselves we're having a discussion about denuclearization, but we're not. We're actually having a discussion on the type of containment we want of North Korea. Because I don't think there's really any sign that he's going to fully denuclearize, and we can come up with all of these metrics, but again, I think they're based on fiction. You know, we all know the reasons why these words mean different things in different places, and what he's done are facilities that aren't that important, and there's really little sign that he's actually willing to denuclearize fully. So I think what we're actually talking about is that North Korea is and will be a nuclear weapons state. And then how do we deal with that? And there are sort of two approaches. One is, which I think is what the Moon Jae-in government is proposing, is sort of engagement, you know, that you sort of hug them close, and if they have these weapons, maybe they've satisfied that insecurity and that they've addressed that, and now they're focused more on economic development, and that if you sort of engage in that, maybe they'll behave, and maybe these weapons won't be, you know, that important as long as he's talking and negotiating. And maybe we can have an arms control agreement of sorts that will have some reductions on their side that will make it a little less dangerous. And that's sort of option one. And option two is, you know, a more assertive containment policy by bolstering sort of forces in the region and pushing back more assertively. And that's probably option two. And I think in the US, we are a long way from recognizing that that is a choice, because people do not want to let go of this denuclearization idea, because living with a country with ICBMs that can hit the United States is a very, very big deal. I mean, there's only two countries with the intention and capability to do that at the moment, and they were both very big deals when they happened. And so I think there's, you know, but I think we're beyond the point really where full rollback is possible. So engagement, yeah, I mean, I guess I will be nervous because I'm nervous about the entire process. You know, I'm nervous that we're, you know, that by raising expectations, that what's going to happen when those expectations are dashed, but also does it actually feed into that long-term strategic debate about the type of containment that we want. And I am also concerned about that first option of containment, because it works till it doesn't work. You know, it basically is accommodating Kim Jong-un until he decides that it no longer serves his interests and he should go back to brinksmanship, which I think we know through history is what usually happens in situations like this. Is when things begin to reverse a little bit, it goes back to aggression, and they're in a much stronger position. I do agree that I think the sanctions are the last thing the United States lets go, partly because of the bureaucratic fighting within the administration, that they know that if they loosen the sanctions, then that can be very hard to put that sort of genie back in the bottle at that point. So I think peace treaties and other types of accommodations are more likely than sanctions relief from the US perspective, just in terms of how they rank, how the Hawks rank their priorities internally.
Okay. I have to wrap up just with one. Actually, in principle, I think there's most South Koreans are very much supportive toward engagement policy. On one hand, on the other, maybe we have to think about how we are going to safeguard ourselves from North Korea. And it is not about the engagement itself, but it's about under what condition, how much, how fast we are going to engage North Korea. So President Moon Jae-in proposed a railway connection and all this. It's a rather long-term vision, and to provide North Korea with a different paths we'd like to have with North Korea. And also gas, there are others like gas pipeline and all the humanitarian engagement and opening up the 23 special economies. So all these are in the plan, but actually the condition must be met. Actually, he actually underscored. So, but actually, as Ambassador Kim mentioned, when the denuclearization process is irreversible, we will go ahead. But actually, though, we should provide some kind of alternative future to North Korea. But on the other, actually, what Tongbi mentioned about, we have to think about humanitarian engagement with North Korea. Not only humanitarian assistance, but actually kind of develop the human capital in North Korea. But I think there are many opportunities for outsiders to go into North Korea to do some humanitarian works and to bring about real change in North Korea from the bottom. But those actions and plans should not actually undermine the international cooperation on sanctions, actually. But on the other, we have to think of under what condition we are going to cross out some sanction measures in a reverse way. Okay? But we have not discussed under what condition we are going to lift up sanctions. So whether it is the right time to do this. But anyhow, we have more questions than answers after having more than a 9-minute discussion, but actually that's always been the case. That's why actually, the reason why we have these kinds of things. But please join me in thanking the speakers for their excellent presentation and responses. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can all hear me all right, even in the back. That sounds good. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon and welcome to this second panel on hybrid threats, comparing insights from East Asia and Europe. My name is Alexander Matelaar. I'm professor at the Institute for European Studies here in Brussels, also affiliated with the Egmont Institute, the Belgian MFA think tank. I will have the pleasure of acting as your host for this second panel in today's event. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by this stunning female lineup for this debate. We will have Dr. Bonnie Jenkins on my far left, who's president of the Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security and Conflict Transformation, which is a non-profit organization, and she's also a senior fellow responsible for foreign policy dossiers at the Brookings Institution. We're also delighted to be joined by Dr. Young H. Pak, who served in the office of the Director of National Intelligence and who is currently the SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korean Studies and Senior Fellow also at the Brookings Institution. And thirdly, by Dr. Ji-Jung Park, who's the Senior Fellow for Nuclear Policy and Technology at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. As is indicated on the program, this panel deals with hybrid threats, and we have identified 3 guiding questions for initiating the debate. Firstly, which are the most important hybrid threats that can be detected in the East Asian theater and in the European theater. Secondly, this panel seeks to analyze the way in which different alliances deal with these hybrid threats. And then thirdly, we can also reserve some attention for discussing the impact that these hybrid threats may have on the domestic politics of individual target countries. Now, I do know everyone has specific regional subject matter expertise. We do not cover everything exhaustively, but I think these are broad guiding questions that can help us to initiate some thinking. We're also very keen to solicit input and additional questions from the audience, but I would first like to give the individual speakers an opportunity to perhaps in a couple of minutes kick off the debate by tackling the overarching question: which threats do we think of when discussing hybrid issues? In what way do they unfold? Where do we see them materializing? What are the different intuitive responses to these that emanate in different regional contexts, and so on and so forth? Ji-jung, would you perhaps care to kick off?
Thank you, Chair. I'm Ji-young Park from ASEAN Institute. First, I'd like to begin my talk with the definition of hybrid threat, because in East Asia or in South Korea, hybrid threat is not a very familiar term, because we use the traditional security or non-traditional security for incoming threats, but the concept of hybrid threat is not openly discussed recently. But since we are dealing with the conventional threat or non-traditional threats, the combining of these two makes the hybrid threat, because hybrid threats employs conventional and non-conventional threats simultaneously to achieve a certain goal. And it employs the many various actors and many various means and mixture of tools of political or economical or the diplomatic tools to achieve some goals. And in East Asia, unlike the European countries, we do not share all the same security issues, because in East Asia we have China, Japan, Korea, and Russia, and the DPRK. So in some parts, like in economic part, South Korea is in a very close relationship with China, but in some other matters like DPRK, China is allies with DPRK. In contrast, South Korea is allies with the United States and Japan. And with the Japan and Korea, we are same allies with the United States, but we have some territorial dispute between Japan and Korea. So we do not share the same goal of security, and we have a different interest in the East Asian region. So this hybrid threat depends on this hybrid concept of a hybrid threat is very different depending on what country you are in or what environment you are in. So I'd like to say that I will talk about the South Korean issue first rather than the whole East Asian country issues. In South Korea, we do not discuss much about the hybrid threat, but we are aware of its importance. Even we do not use the terminology of a hybrid threat, but we are very much concerned about the cybersecurity and the combination of cyber attack with the conventional attack. So we have some departments dealing with cyber attack in the military forces or intelligence institutions. The reason we are very much focused on cybersecurity is because we are surrounded in the notorious countries like China or DPRK. In the cyber domain, they are Russia, China, and DPRK is a major violence force in the cyber domain. And during the past 5 years, we experienced 19 cases of cyber attack from the PRK alone. That was just the small attempt, or sometimes it makes some cracks in our system, like banking systems, government systems, or some military, the military suppliers, or sometimes it was to the broadcasting systems and government-supported research institutions. So we are very aware of the serious, the risk of the cybersecurity and its combination with other security matters. And other than that, in South Korea we have some vulnerabilities, like South Korea is surrounded by big powers like China, Japan, and Russia. Sometimes the other big powers like United States. So we have some difficulties to survive alone as a small nation among the big powers. And we have another vulnerability area, like South Korea experienced Korean War 70 years before, and since then, domestically, we still have some serious ideological dispute. So this can be a vulnerable area for the hybrid attack. And South Korea doesn't have much resources inland, so we heavily depend on our resources outside. So this can be another weak point of South Korea and can be a target of a hybrid attack. Also, our economy heavily depends on outside world. So, like the Ukraine case, if some entity plans to attack the economically with economic threat, then the South Korea is very will experience very high risk. And South Korea is heavily depends on its economy to China. And as I mentioned before, China is the major adversary in relation to the ideology to South Korea. So we have a very weak points and lots of areas to be a target of a hybrid attack in combination with military forces. But for the preparation or the response to this kind of hybrid attack, the readiness to respond it is very primitive stage. We have some forces to defend for the cyber attack, but for the other areas, we do not have much plan to respond or mitigate the result. So the cyber area would be the first priority to defend the hybrid attack in terms of defending or surviving the system. And okay, first I will stop here, then if there is any questions or further discussions, I will continue.
Thank you. So thank you for defining hybrid threats, because I had to look it up when we first looked at this conference and what to discuss today, because we don't talk about it in the East Asia context. So I looked it up, and I see using all measures, economic, military, diplomatic, yada yada, for political goals. And I thought, oh wow, I've been a hybrid threats expert for 10 years. Because I think, having been a North Korea, looking primarily at North Korea, from the intelligence community and from the US government, North Korea can basically write the book and learn, and a lot of other countries can learn from how North Korea has used hybrid threats or asymmetric capabilities to try to bend the world to their will. So when I look at North Korea over the years, and they've employed a lot of means, short of war, short of red lines, short of spurring a military conflict to try to shape the world to their advantage. So I look at the chemical biological weapons. Kim Jong-un has shown to be willing to use a nerve agent to kill his half-brother in an international airport. North Korea, as Dr. Park has mentioned, continues to engage in cyber activities with their bases in China and in other parts of the world. They've developed an advanced nuclear weapons program to make up for their lack of conventional forces. And I think it's important to point out that hybrid threats are not, at least from the North Korea perspective, are not necessarily employed only when there's time of tension, because they can also employ it during engagement. A couple of examples. One is where we don't talk about human rights anymore. Dr. Chae-gang at the last panel mentioned how we don't talk about human rights. And that's because they don't want to talk about human rights. And so we've dropped one of our earlier demands about human rights, because North Korea doesn't want to talk about human rights, because there was the threat was that engagement, they'll stop engaging if we start raising the issue of human rights. Second example of using hybrid threats during relatively peaceful times is when they raise the issue of returning defectors from South Korea. Now, I don't think any of the defectors went back or were removed from South Korea to go to North Korea, but you can imagine the fear that might have been generated as a result of this mood of engagement, in which there might have been a possibility that the South Korean government might have returned those waitresses who were allegedly lured away on falsehoods away from North Korea. So you know. When I think about hybrid threats, when I think about coercion, I think of North Korea and how it, despite its size, despite its poverty, and despite its conventional capabilities, relative lack of conventional capabilities, that they can shape the regional dynamics and the international conversation. Because you know what, we're in Europe and we're talking about the North Korea threat as one of the as driving some of these regional tension. So I'll stop there and turn this over to my colleague Bonnie.
First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. This is great to be back in Brussels and to be talking about North Korea here and in the Korean Peninsula. I've been kind of a proponent for opening up discussions on these issues beyond just the typical usual suspects. A little bit about my background, and wasn't explained. I spent most of my career at the State Department, and so I'm very much a proponent, believer of multilateralism and engagement and diplomacy. So it's good to be here to see more discussions here in Europe, to see some discussions on North Korea. I'm always interested in ways to involve more parties and more unusual suspects in these discussions. I also had the same question about hybrid threats, because it's not, I also asked the question, what does that mean? Because we've used the word asymmetrical threats at one point to describe things that were not traditional threats, and they were kind of new types of threats. And so when I look at the word hybrid threats, I think more in terms of just things that are not traditional. But I also agree that they make up more than just what we would think of in terms of some of these issues. I will repeat some of what's been said, because I think we have to deal with the issue of cyber, because we recognize that it's been used already in the region. But we also know our history with Russia now with cyber, and that's also an issue that's being dealt with a number of countries in Europe, where Russia has also used some of its cyber attacks to try to affect domestic politics. So I think that's an issue both here and in Korean East Asia situation. Another issue is the U.S. itself, and U.S. diplomacy and President Trump. And in that way, a threat only in terms of different positions that we might be taking from what we've taken in the past, how that has created uncertainty in terms of both our relationships in Europe and with our allies in East Asia regarding what U.S. goals are and what our goals will be in the future, what we're trying to accomplish, and what is our strategy in both of these regions. There's issues of sanctions, which are not necessarily a threat, but the effect of sanctions and what that can do. We're trying to actually find ways to convince North Korea to do what we want them to do, but in the same time we recognize that sanctions can also be, in doing that, does destabilize. And that may have its own ramifications. And in the European context, it's interesting because the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, and we're threatening Europe with going after them if they get rid of their sanctions on Iran. So sanctions have an interesting way in which they're reacting, which are causing reactions in both Europe and East Asia. There's human rights violations, which has been also mentioned, which we don't say much about. There's a lot of, obviously, NGOs and others who are very interested and want something to be done about these issues, but it's not really at the forefront with a field that's crowded by other more traditional threats. We have things like nuclear, obviously the nuclear issue. My background is in weapons of mass destruction. So of course, also concerned about the bio and chem that North Korea possesses. Apparently this is not as much of a concern for Europe because most of the countries in Europe are parties to the conventions. But we do have a different situation with North Korea and their possession of weapons and lack of disarmament on any of that. And then we have things like food security, which is an issue that we've talked about in the first panel, a little bit about some humanitarian assistance that we could be providing to help with some of the food and water security issues that you have in the region, in East Asia, particularly in North Korea. And then there's also things like infectious disease, an issue that I worked on a little bit while I was in government, and the fact that we don't have much of a sense of what's going on in North Korea on these issues. We work very closely with other partners in that region on these issues of infectious disease. But we know things like we've been taking money away from services we've been doing in North Korea on tuberculosis, for example. So there's those global health issues that we also have to think about in that region. And then we mentioned, of course, maritime disputes in the region, which is also creates its own issues. And then, of course, the conventional imbalance and the conventional issues, which creates the need for U.S. troops to remain in the region. So those are the things that I would just highlight in terms of some of the what we call the hybrid threats, which are not just the conventional threats, but some of these other threats that are global and also affect these regions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies. I think we have already identified some recurring threats that actually help explain why this panel is relevant to a Brussels audience in the first place. The definitional conundrum is something that we're all familiar with, but the fact is the Brussels debate is very much driven by the whole hybrid terminology, whereas that seems to be much less the case on the other side of the globe, and it may have a thing or two to do with the relative difference in the changing time frame, Cold War, post-Cold War, post-Cold War, if you will, in the sense that on the European continent there was a very clear-cut and stark distinction between Cold War and post-Cold War, whereas things always remained a bit more grey in East Asia. And as a result, a European audience, now with the return of grey things, is much more trying to get its bearings. And in that sense, the perspective from Korea and East Asia more generally is probably a relevant one. Also taking into account that both Korea as well as European nations and the European Union have to consider both alliance relationships, relations with neighbors that occasionally engage in quite worrisome behavior, to put it very mildly. So I think we are witnessing a lot of relevant patterns emerging from this debate and putting these different perspectives together. Can I perhaps gauge, are there questions or comments from the appetite to sort of get this debate going further into a specific direction that is of particular interest to you?
Thank you for the second comments. I'm Dong Kim from the Korea Chair. I have two questions. What can the United States do to help its allies deal with hybrid threats? And related to that, would it be productive or counterproductive to qualify the relationship between the U.S. alliance's defense obligations and hybrid threats?
Thank you. Are there other takers at this stage?
Well, thank you. A couple of the speakers have...
Can I also ask you to identify?
Yes, David Fouquet of CERI's Graduate Studies Program at the other Free University of Brussels. A couple of the other the speakers have put their finger on something that's been in the back of my mind for several months. That's the chemical biological warfare threat or presence in the arsenal of the DPRK. I mean, it was obviously displayed in stark and terrifying fashion in Kuala Lumpur. You mentioned Kim Jong-nam's murder. But behind that, there must be a whole arsenal that no one seems to be concerned or talking about publicly very much. Perhaps I'm wrong, but it seems to me another very potent threat. Thank you.
Thank you. There's also a question.
Yeah, Ramon Pacheco, also from the Korea Chair. Can I ask you about the cyber threat, which I know at least a couple of you have written about. To what extent is this being considered, if at all, when it comes to dealing with North Korea? Because recently there was a report in South Korea about North Korean cyber attacks in South Korea itself. Actually, as we speak, we have a conference in Brussels about cybersecurity, and North Korea is one of the topics under discussion. And yesterday, with a colleague attended that conference, they were saying how in South Korea had to give up their cyber defense because of North Korea, China to an extent as well, but especially North Korea. So is this something that is being discussed at all, or do you think that we are leaving it behind as we move into discussion about denuclearization of North Korea and other matters?
Could I start? Can I start? So let me deal the chemical biological weapons. North Korea reportedly has the third largest stockpile of chemical biological weapons, after U.S. and Russia. And whether it's being talked about before, more publicly, it's not. It's died. It's kind of died off along with the human rights issues. So let me compare two points. Right. One is, when President Trump gave his UN General Assembly speech, he listed a whole thing of North Korea bad things. the treatment, the mistreatment, and eventual death of Otto Warmbier, nuclear and missile tests, the killing of Kim Jong-nam, the cyber activities, the abductions of Japanese citizens. So it was like a whole list of your entire wish list for what we would want to ping North Korea about. A year later, at the last UN General Assembly speech, it was North Korea stopped testing their nuclear and ballistic missile programs. It was a very U.S.-centric because we care most about the advanced missile programs and advanced nuclear capabilities, but none of those other things mattered, or at least they didn't come up in this UN General Assembly speech by President Trump. And so a lot of things we shed a lot of issues in the past year. And I think it's true of cyber threats. I think cyber threats are, because it transcends borders, we should be talking about it everywhere. And because all of these, North Korea has been accused of WannaCry, and that affected the European systems. And as well as a Sony hack from 2014 and some South Korean media, banking systems, military systems. And so, on the cyber threat, it's not just a regional issue, it's a global issue. On the advanced weapons programs, what I thought was really funny was when they did the ICBM test, North Korea came out and said, "Oh, Europe, you shouldn't worry because these are not for you." Now, do you take North Korea's word for it, and that this is not for you, even when the Secretary of Defense Mattis said at the time that this is very disconcerting because this means that nowhere on the globe is safe from North Korea's ballistic missile program and their nuclear weapons. So. I'll stop there and pass it off to my colleagues.
Just very briefly, just to add on the chemical and biological weapons issue. I think what you're seeing is we just have an interesting way of dealing with the North Korea situation, which is very disjointed in terms of how we connect issues in that region. And so the nuclear issue has always been predominant. And obviously to this administration that's the same. But in most cases, chemical and biological are important too. And the efforts that we put toward our work in Geneva and in The Hague, working through the implementation bodies, our situation and discussions on Syria. In many other cases, it is important. But for some reason, we have, and not just on this issue, but in some other issues when it comes to North Korea, the way in which we approach that country is just not particularly strategic in many ways. But it's not just the U.S., it's other countries could be raising this issue. The chemical and biological weapons is a concern, it's a global issue. It's a global, it's one that we all should be worried about, but it's not just the U.S., and other countries are also not doing enough to raise this issue and bring attention to it. Maybe it's a place where they can. Maybe they can take up the gauntlet and say, we need to think about this more, and even if we were by some miracle to resolve the nuclear issue and convince them to get rid of their nuclear weapons, you still have these other weapons to worry about. And those are the ones that are more likely to be used around the world right now. In terms of what we can do and to work the countries on these threats, we've always had a situation where in Europe we're much more multilateral, and then in East Asia we're much more bilateral in our relations. I wonder if we need to make sure that we're strengthening our alliance in Europe, of course, and NATO, and what we're doing with the EU, and we all know that we've had some problems with that recently. And the best way to resolve some of these issues is to continue to work with other countries, particularly the ones who have been our friends for many years. And in terms of North Korea and East Asia, we should continue to strengthen our relationships with countries in that region. But that's also been a little sidetracked, of course, by Kim Jong-un's his own diplomatic outreach and his own diplomatic engagements, which in many ways has foreshadowed ours in terms of our engagement with some of the countries in the region, has gotten a lot more attention. So I think we need to get back on track with that, but we also need to get back on track, or if we ever were on track in this administration, in terms of a strategy for how we're going to approach North Korea, and spell out exactly what we're going to be doing, and that can incorporate some of these other threats and concerns. But without a strategy, these other threats are going to continue to be there. We're not going to have a way to really address them.
I will prefer to talk about the role of alliance in the cyber tech. The role of alliance is not limited to the US-South Korea alliance or the South Korea-Japan alliance, something like that. We share the same vulnerability in regard to the cyber tech. Any banking system in any European country can be a target of North Korea's cyber tech. So what we should do is we gather all the information, all the attacks from the PRK or any other potential cyber threat countries, and we have to make the cooperative defense system about those kind of attacks. Also, we have to share the information, and the other important thing is that it's very difficult to identify who is the actor of the attack. It means that it's difficult to find out the digital forensics or any evidence of the bad behaviors. So we have to develop some technological advance to detect those kind of evidence, and it cannot be done by any one single nation. So in those areas of developing the technology to verify or detect the evidence of cyber attack should be done collaboratively.
I have one more thing. On the Tongfi, your question about what we can do more, and to follow up with Dr. Park's comments. Within the alliance structure itself, there are mechanisms for talking about these hybrid threats, right? So the 2+2 dialogues, for example, they talk about cyber as well as non-proliferation issues. And it's not just with the U.S.-South Korea relationship, but it's also in the U.S.-Japan relationship, where we're talking about counter-terror issues, about cyber issues, and we talk about it at the working level all the way up to the top levels. So I think with the alliance structures make it possible to have these strategic dialogues about all these different types of issues, and I think it makes sense, especially to talk about cyber, because when you have an alliance, it means that you're sharing information, and if you're sharing information on computers, it means that you need a joint effort on protecting that information. So North Korea has reportedly extracted some information from from the military intranet, in which the USFK and the US and South Korea information was extracted by the North Koreans. So I think the alliance itself requires a discussion about cyber issues and other issues, and to make up for and to make sure that information sharing is buttressed by strong security. It only takes one person to stick a USB in a government computer, and so I think that makes sense to me. But I would also add that it's important for South Korea and Japan to talk about these types of issues. The GSOMIA, the intelligence sharing agreement, was like extracting teeth to get both sides to get on board with sharing intelligence information. And I think it's sputtering on to a certain extent, but that relationship is something that going away from the hub and spoke model of U.S. alliances in the region to make sure that the region is integrated in these types of efforts.
Thank you. Can I inquire who would like to come in next? Yep, over there in the back.
We were talking about digital forensics. I was very curious because within Interpol, there is already, within the cyber squad, there's already quite a bit of collaboration concerning digital forensics. But of course, within Interpol, we have such countries such as Russia and China who are part of the team. If you go towards certain collaborations on digital forensics, where you exclude those partners because they might be perpetrators, don't you go towards a very difficult and also maybe slightly dangerous path of conflict, basically?
Yeah, over there.
Thank you. My name is Han from Kobe, University, Japan. So I'd like to ask you about the other alliance between Japan and the United States. Thank you. You know, about the trade situation regarding the North Korea, you might know that in Japan, Tokyo has a big frustrations because we cannot see the very exact and in short term, it seems like the denuclearization cannot be done. So in the short run, in a few years. And also the US and North Korea seem like talking about the ICBMs. But if the middle-range missile was not abandoned, it was just nothing for Japan. So, actually the Tokyo government had a very strong frustration about the things regarding all the declaration to stop, to put an end of the Korean War or something like that. And we are also very afraid of things that you are just asking some money or something to the public. So if you have some idea, please open your idea about the role of Japan or US-Japan alliance in the today's situation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Garcia Esteve from Weber Shenwick. So the first part of the discussion, the first panel, we talked a lot about nuclear proliferation and nuclear disarmament. And something that we had touched upon in that conversation was the role of psychology and regime preservation as part of the calculus. And I was wondering if now in this panel on hybrid threats, we could, I guess, apply the same sort of logic or try and have the same discussion of, can we conceive of hybrid threats as part of a regime preservation calculus? And in what way things like misinformation, whether it is externally, something we're used to in Europe, or even internally, feeding directly down to the population, or cyber issues, how is that part of the long-term, during the current situation, but also kicking the can down the road? How does that fit into how the society eventually transforms, and how we have to have a plan in place to deal with that? Thank you.
Have digital forensics, the role of Japan, hybrid and regime preservation. Would any of the speakers like to comment on any of these issues?
I will briefly cover about the digital forensic issue. To respond to the hybrid attack, I think we should respond it to together with the nations or entities who shares the same vulnerabilities. So if we talk about the cyber issue, then the many countries can share the same vulnerability toward the North Korean cyber attack or toward Russian cyber attack or Chinese cyber attack. So we don't need to combine all the nations in the globe to protect from cyber attack. There should be a group of nations who share the same vulnerability toward a certain nation's cyber attack. So I don't think we cannot share all the technology information or all the technology development together.
I also want to respond to the forensics question. And my understanding, because I'm not sure I know all of what you're talking about, but my understanding is that Russia and China may not be part of the discussions at Interpol on forensics. Is that correct?
I do not know.
Okay. So you're asking, it's more of a question about should they be part of those discussions?
Because, well, since I assumed they were part, since especially quite a few of the high-level servants, well, public servants basically, within Interpol were also, well, is still a discussion from Chinese and Russian origins. But yeah, then maybe this is also an interesting question, then should they be part of those investigations?
Well, maybe that's why the Chinese detained the Interpol chief. There's no love lost there, right?
Well, I guess one way I would look at it is Interpol is, of course, an international organization, and as such, you know, it has within its power the ability to discuss and resolve issues and make decisions with all the partners and all the parties to the organization. I'm not. The cyber issue to me is still. There's a lot of questions that still are out there about cyber. I think we know that it can do very bad things. And we know that certain countries are much more advanced at knowing how to do bad things than others. And it's already becoming a have and have not kind of thing, where some are much more advanced and others are not. In that way, it may be right for the kind of negotiation where you want to even out the playing field, or if this was an arms control treaty situation, you would say, well, you have it and we don't, we want you to disarm, okay, because it's a bad thing. But it's not an arms control situation, it's not quite that clean. However, I'm not sure at this stage that we are ready to know, we are ready to push people out of a negotiation and the discussion on it. We know we don't like what Russia is doing. And for that reason alone, it'd be great to say you cannot be part of anything. On the other hand, if you have discussions in a certain format that may be a little more theoretically, and maybe not this case because we saw it happen with China, but in a different case under the radar screen, where there could be agreed goals and benchmarks. There may be opportunities to have discussions. Because that's how these things sometimes start, with arms control, the traditional arms control negotiations, which took years and years. Started before, you know, a lot of things were resolved. So I understand definitely the desire to not talk to China and Russia because of, and even North Korea if they were a part of it, because of the situation and because of what we know they do and can do. But at the same time, because the cyber threat can be so great and so much more than what it is now, there may be opportunities to try to have some discussions. And maybe some of these international organizations that are not in the forefront, where you can have more exchange, could be possible. So I guess it's a controversial issue, but I'm just trying to throw a different light on that. Another thing to think about is, if I understand your question about the hybrid threat and regime change, and if I understand your question, you're saying in a nuclear situation we were promoting regime change or instability as a way to achieve our goals. Is that the question? Is that the premise?
Almost the opposite. It's
Okay.
So if we understand that the North Korean regime, their relationship to their nuclear program is that it is a tool to safeguard the longevity of the regime, can we apply the same calculus to hybrid tactics? Will they see that as something in their toolbox to, after the denuclearization issue or whatever, we'll say compromise will be arrived to, is it a way that they can, after that finish line, hold on to power in the country?
And that's why we need to deal with chemical and biological weapons. Because if we get rid of if we deal with the nuclear issue, if we ever deal with that, and we don't deal with these other things, there's still issues that have to be dealt with. And we need to not get to the point where, okay, we got that, we still have these things. That's why a more holistic approach would probably be better. Now you can't put everything in the negotiations. I mean, you can't do everything at once, but you can certainly try to do as many as you can, with the understanding that if that's their tactic and that's the way they relate to countries and try to get countries to do what they want them to do, then you should think ahead and say, well, if we know that's how they act, maybe we should put some of these things into these negotiations now, rather than wait until later when they can actually use that against us.
On the U.S.-Japan, I hear you on the frustration. I mean, not that you're frustrated, but on the U.S.-Japan, so Abe has staked out. Prime Minister Abe has staked out a lot on this relationship with Trump, being the first to visit with the president-elect back in November, and so I think the U.S.-Japan alliance. And vis-a-vis the North Korea issue and peace on the Korean Peninsula, it's really tough for Japan. So if this whole year of or 6 or 7 months of summits could be a reality show, it would be The Bachelor, and Japan is the only one that did not get a rose, right? And so Tokyo has very little to go on. They have to go through President Trump because that's their only channel. So that makes Tokyo disadvantaged in that way because it has to be filtered through Trump, and that Trump would raise Japanese issues to Kim or to South Korea or to anybody for that matter. Lots of implications for a peace declaration. The first panel talked about the dissolving of the UN command, but it would also, reduction of US troops in South Korea, or removal of US troops on South Korea would mean that Japan is the only one in the region, making it a very lopsided kind of troop placement in the region. It also, on the maximum pressure issue, Japan, as far as I know, Tokyo is still on maximum pressure, which also keeps them in the sidelines of these issues. You would only have to read a couple of North Korean media pieces to see that Pyongyang is just not interested, aside from the reported secret meetings. Japan's issue is abductions. So it's all about whether Trump is going to raise it. President Trump raised it at the UN General Assembly, raised it up and down the street for a little while, but there's no mention of abductions anymore. So I think so Tokyo's frustrations are completely understandable in that they're deliberately sidelined in this seasons of symmetry. But I think, Japan has to play a role because, what does North Korea do when Abe met with Trump in February of 2017? They launched a solid fuel missile, which landed in Japan's EEZ, right? So, Japan is clearly concerned about the shorter range ballistic missiles and North Korea's capabilities. North Korea has not downplayed any of its harsh rhetoric against Tokyo. So Tokyo is still in the bullseye of North Korea provocations. And if I were Tokyo, I'd worry about the Olympics. And this is where the hybrid threats come in. North Korea doesn't have to launch missiles at Japan to ruin the Olympics. They just have to threaten that, or make some movements that satellites can catch, or to stymie South Korean efforts to get North Korea to participate in the Olympics, or they don't give the red carpet treatment to North Korean scouts who are looking for the venues in the way that they did at Pyeongchang. So, you know, if you remember the Pyeongchang Olympics, South Korea had a really hard time selling tickets. And what if Tokyo has that same problem just because North Korea decides to employ one of its tools from its toolkit to ruin Tokyo's Olympics? So that's what I worry about if I were Tokyo, about the Olympics. On the psychology, I think you answered your own question. So I think on the psychology of this of using hybrid threats for regime survival, I see hybrid threats as part and parcel of nuclear weapons advancement. North Korea was founded on guerrilla tactics. The country's founder was a guerrilla fighter, fought with the Chinese, fought with the Soviets, fought against the Japanese imperialists, the American imperialists, and the South Korean jackals. And what, you know, Kim Jong-il did not fight in those guerrilla fights, but he engaged in, you know, the current leader's father, he engaged in hybrid threats, hybrid activities as well. Abductions, making movies, abducting people to make movies, digging tunnels into South Korea, making multiple assassination attempts against the Blue House, landing special operations forces in South Korea. So, you know, and Kim Jong-un, through his grooming process, you know, he was part of the Cheonan, the 2010 attacks against South Korea. And, you know, with Sony, with killing his brother, I see these, you know, at the end of the day, guerrilla tactics are hybrid tactics. You know, you keep poking and prodding to weaken the resolve of the other side. And to shape the external environment. So I think I see that's where the hybrid threats coming in on the regime survival. And because they're masters at ideology, right, and making movies, I see that as a continuing part of their regime survival process. When I look at Kim Jong-un building all those amusement parks, building the skateboard parks, building the condominiums, building the ski resorts, making soap operas that look very much like South Korean soap operas, I see that as also hybrid warfare. Because it's not just about making the North Korean people happy, I think it's also directed at the South Korean youth to show them we're not so bad, we're not so different from you. And that's how I look, that's my perspective on hybrid threats emanating from North Korea, that it's a range of things that don't look necessarily threatening, but that it's an ideological seepage, I think, in trying to make propaganda not look like propaganda.
I will add some about the mention about the Cheonan attack from North Korea. It is the perfect example of hybrid threat or hybrid war. We experienced the Cheonan attack from North Korea, and then inside the domestically in South Korea, there was the fake news spread out that the Cheonan was not destroyed by the North Korean attack. Rather, there was lots of rumors spread out, and we don't know if the rumor or the fake news, that the origin of the fake news is really from North Korea, or it's just a domestic thing driven by some political objectives. We don't know the origin, but for the fake news, the society was divided into two, and it can lead to very serious situation on the security matters. So combining with the conventional attack and with some fake news through SNS or the other rumors can lead to very serious result for some society.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add an additional point of discussion? Or
Can I add one more thing?
sure.
So I think it's interesting that we haven't talked about the 900-pound gorilla in the room, and that's China. And in the China issue, to this day, Beijing will not blame North Korea for that, or for Sony, or for anything else for that matter. So in a way, China enables North Korea to use these tactics. And also, South Korea and Japan happen to live in a really terrible neighborhood. With China, not just about North Korea, but it's also about China, and that the Chinese use of their economic power to try to punish South Korea for the deployment of the terminal high altitude area defense, the ballistic missile defense in South Korea. I think to this day, South Korea is still, struggling with the fact that Beijing had an official economic boycott of South Korean businesses, and that the South Korean businesses lost $7 billion or something like that overall as a result. And the Chinese tourism to South Korea has still yet to recover from the boycott. And Chinese economic might is a way of that Beijing has been trying to shape South Korea's decisions and trying to erode the bases of U.S.-South Korea alliance by using its economic power and thinking that the gravitational pull of its economic might is going to lure South Korea away from the U.S. And I think Tokyo and Seoul see that, and they try to hedge by talking to China, talking to each other, talking to Russia, talking to Europe.
900-pound gorillas do not have the habit of going by unnoticed wherever they go. Hamon, I think you also wanted to pitch in?
It was one point on fake news that was mentioned. One point on fake news that was mentioned is a very simple question. Is there any concern that North Korea will try to influence South Korean politics, for example, in the next election, in the way we think Russia has done and China has done in the US, for example, or in Europe? Is this an active concern in South Korea, that the threat from North Korea might influence the voting patterns, for example, in South Korea?
Thank you. I originally had a more generic question which I was going to abandon, and then Mrs. Pak raised it tangentially. The title of the conference talks about transatlantic and transpacific alliances. We've become accustomed more recently to Indo-Pacific alliances or coalitions, which seem to be much more directed against China, containment of China. Now, you've brought in the distant, almost isolated role of Japan, but there are still other allies involved: India, Australia, New Zealand, even other countries. How do they fit in? Or is that another rival or foe, or whatever you want to call it, China, as opposed to North Korea?
Hi, I'm Andrew Hansen with a faith-based Brussels NGO. In terms of regime survival, what are the indicators that you're looking at really from the outside?
North Korea?
Yeah, initially North Korea and the regime survival.
Indicators for what?
Whether the regime actually survived, the stability of the regime, the survival of the regime. Yeah.
Any additional points at this stage? Or shall we? Indicators for regime survival, Indo-Pacific alliances, fake news, any takers?
I guess I'll say something about the other alliances. I mean, my perspective is that whether you're talking about New Zealand or some of these other countries that you mentioned, there's been, generally speaking, just a hands-off in terms of the ways in which countries have dealt with the North Korea situation. I mean, it's so predominantly, you know, the nuclear issue has predominated the issue of the relationship. And many countries have just, even if they're interested, have taken a very much of a hands-off approach. Even the countries within the region have kind of ceded, for the most part, there was resolution of the nuclear issue to the U.S. and North Korea. I don't necessarily think that's a good idea, but you know, that seems to be the way it really is right now, and that would involve other countries, whether in Northeast Asia or other parts of Asia as well. I'll let my colleagues talk about the indicators because they probably know more about that than me. All I will say is that the issue of regime survival for North Korea has been around for a long time, and they're still here. And so I remember people used to say about Cuba, you know, that one day Cuba would implode and they're waiting for Cuba to fall apart, and Castro just seemed to live forever. And so, I mean, it's been a question for a long time about whether they will survive, and they were thinking it won't, and we'll do these sanctions, and we'll take these actions, and maybe that'll help the regime. That'll push forward the possibility that regime won't survive. But it's still here. So I don't know what the indicators are. I'll let my colleagues speak more directly to that. But it's not something I would bet on too much in terms of being part of the strategy. It's out there, but I wouldn't necessarily count on that as being a possibility.
On the Indo-Pacific, I mean, Abe and Modi are meeting today. You know, that's part of Tokyo's effort to shore up ties with other partners in the region. The difference between, I mean, one of the biggest differences between the Trans-Pacific and the Transatlantic Alliances, as Tongfi probably knows like the back of his hand, is the hub and spokes model in the Pacific versus the NATO consolidated model. And I think as much as these various leaders, you know, we have ASEAN in Southeast Asia, right? But that's still, you know, it's still a work in progress. And I think with the East Asian countries, it's still a U.S.-centric hub and spoke model, and that. But that I think Prime Minister Abe and the South Korean President Moon are trying to increase those networks. I mean, the South Korean President was here in Europe, you know, for a multi-country tour. He's been to Russia, Latin America too, I think. Did he go to Latin America? Maybe that's next. And trying to shore up its, you know, South Korea's relationships with the outside world. For a while, South Korea had this middle power thing, right? The Global Korea project, trying to, you know, part of the middle, what is it, the middle, but I think the North Korea issue sucks up all of that energy. And I also wonder about capacity for South Korea and Japan to have these relations, or have more robust relationships with with non-US countries, because so much of the past decades have been so US focused on that alliance. On the fake news on the Cheonan issue. I think one of the most insidious parts about fake news is that you don't know who to trust. Everything seems political, were you talking about the elections in South Korea? Yeah, the potential for on elections. I don't see. I mean, who knows? Maybe there are North Korean attempts at affecting issues there. But so I'll let my colleague speak to that. On the regime perseverance issue, I think as long as China supports North Korea, I think that's a huge anchor in the North Korean survival story.
On the fake news, there are too much fake news in South Korea, and well, so we don't know what portion is up to North Korea. Sometimes the fake news is to support Korean government, or sometimes to oppose Korean government. There is too many fake news, so we cannot blame the fake news to North Korea. But one sure thing is Korean society is very much heavily IT-oriented society. Everybody always carry their cell phones and search for the news, and they share the as a group for the fake news or the other informations. So one sure thing is Korea is very vulnerable to the fake news, and this can be a very weak point. And if one adversary to South Korea wants to attack this point, then it's going to be a very good target.
Molly, is there anything you'd like to add?
No. We're just nodding in agreement.
All right, great. Ladies and gentlemen, we have exhausted the available time. I'd like to leave you with some parting comments on content and a few practical announcements. Last year in the NATO Brussels community, there was quite a bit of interest for the 50th anniversary of the so-called Harmel Doctrine, the Harmel Report of 67, balancing deterrence with dialogue, what constitutes the appropriate balancing act. That was, of course, a different time frame in which both the deterrence equation received quite a lot of prominence after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The term hybrid threats had luckily not been invented yet then, but it would have, the debate would have sounded eerily familiar from a perspective of anyone familiar with East-West relations in 1967. Now, towards the end of his career, I was involved in compiling an overview of Harmel's writings. He actually authored something that was pretty prescient, in the sense that at the end of the Cold War period, he offered the prognosis that due to increased interdependence on a global scale, whatever the future would bring, it would imply that the regional and even domestic politics of different parts of the world would become much more intermeshed with one another. And that is something that we are witnessing today, a generation after that particular juncture of history. And that, I believe, provides us with a good takeaway why debates such as these can offer us some guidance in terms of thinking about the world, especially by being aware of the extent to which what happens in East Asia influences European politics, and vice versa. That being said, the most important practical announcement is that there are drinks awaiting us outside. So we will keep this conclusion very brief. I also very much would like to thank the colleagues from the Brookings Institution and from ASAN to travel all this way to Brussels. It's not the greatest day, but there's a lot of things that are taking place here, so I do hope that this will have been worthwhile the travel time. I also need to thank the sponsors, most notably NATO and the Republic of Korea Embassy for making this possible. This is also an event that was driven forward by the KF-VUB Korea Chair, so I very much would like to thank my VUB colleagues Ramon, Paula and Max for setting this event up and ensuring that we all had a very stimulating afternoon, and I'm sure we can get some more stimulus over a drink later on. Thank you very much, and I look forward to welcoming you as one of our